The language we use to describe our history and the world around us shapes our reality. Those who control the words control which questions get asked, which victims get remembered, and which crimes get prosecuted. Examples of this are everywhere, especially when war and the violence of hierarchies are being described. This has been discussed at length when it comes to the selective use of passive voice in media and the newspeak that government propagandists use to cover for their crimes. But today, I want to talk about how World War III actually already happened and was hidden in plain sight using language. In the half century following World War II, war continued to touch every inhabited continent, costing millions of lives and fundamentally restructuring the political and economic order of the planet. But we call this time the Cold War. Of course, it's not recognized like this in other parts of the world because these were very serious conflicts that are still impacting people's lives today. The other thing is that these conflicts had nothing to do with keeping the peace, as they are often presented. The other common excuse was fighting against communism, but that wasn't the real goal either. Communism was a threat in the sense that communist countries removed themselves from the American economic sphere. They nationalized industries, rejected foreign investment, and traded primarily within their own bloc. From the American perspective, every country that went communist was a market lost, a source of resources denied, a place where American corporations could no longer extract profits. This explains why the United States was willing to tolerate right-wing dictatorships while obsessively opposing even moderate left-wing governments. Dictatorships were acceptable, even preferable, as long as they kept their countries open for American business. A dictator who allowed American corporations to extract resources and exploit labor while brutalizing his own population was an ally. A left-wing government who implemented land reform or nationalized industries was an enemy who had to be destroyed. George Kennan, the architect of America's containment policy, was not shy about the true intentions of U.S. foreign policy. In a 1948 memo to the State Department, he wrote with unusual candor about what American foreign policy actually required.
We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. We should cease to talk about vague and, for the Far East, unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we are going to have to deal in straight power concepts. The less we are then hampered by idealistic slogans, the better.
This was the quiet part said out loud. America would maintain its disproportionate share of global wealth through coercion. Countries that threaten this arrangement by nationalizing resources, implementing land reform, or adopting economic systems that excluded American capital would face consequences. Democracy and human rights were only talking points for propaganda. The actual policy was all about maintaining positions of disparity. This is the thing that most Americans fail to understand or refuse to accept. The foreign policy of their government has nothing to do with protecting human rights or even protecting the interests of the average person. These are two different lies, but one serves the other. The lie about human rights gives people an excuse for supporting wars that they know are inhumane but think are in their best interests. The only tangible benefit that we can point to for the average person is the exchange rate of the US dollar, which allows us to get cheap goods from other countries. But that's entirely unethical, so it's not really an excuse. Even with that, there's an argument to be made that other economic arrangements might actually be more beneficial to the average US citizen than dollar supremacy. The ruling class in this country benefits greatly from all this violence, though, which is why there's so much propaganda to reinforce it. And this is also why they erased World War III and called it a Cold War. I know it sounds crazy, but I think you'll understand by the end of this video, and maybe you'll see why America Bad isn't just a meme. Let's start with the first major conflict after World War II, and what I would consider the beginning of World War III. The Korean War, But since we're making a point of talking about these labels, it's important to mention that within the Korean Peninsula, this is obviously not called the Korean War. South Koreans call it the 625 War after the day the war began, June 25th, 1950. In North Korea, the war is officially known as the Fatherland Liberation War, or the Joseon War. By the time Nazi Germany surrendered in May of 1945, American and Soviet officials were already eyeing each other with suspicion across the rubble of Europe. By the time Japan surrendered in August of 1945, the two powers were already maneuvering to claim pieces of the post-war world. The temporary wartime partnership, born of necessity and sustained by a common enemy, dissolved the moment that enemies ceased to exist. Korea had been a Japanese colony since 1910. 35 years of brutal occupation had left deep scars. The Japanese had extracted resources, exploited labor, attempted to erase Korean culture and language, and conscripted Koreans into their military and their brothels. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Koreans expected liberation and independence. What they got was a partition imposed by foreign powers. The United States and Soviet Union agreed to temporarily divide Korea at the 38th parallel. Soviet troops would accept the Japanese surrender north of this line. American troops would accept it to the south. Neither superpower had any intention of leaving Korea to the Koreans. The peninsula sat at a strategic location, bordering both China and the Soviet Union with access to the Sea of Japan. For the Soviets, a friendly Korea meant a buffer state and a warm water port. For the Americans, Korea represented a foothold on the Asian mainland, a potential market, and a check on Soviet and Chinese influence in the region. The division itself was arbitrary. The 38th parallel had no historical, cultural, or geographic significance. An American officer later admitted that he and another officer had drawn the line in about 30 minutes, looking at a map and trying to ensure the capital city of Seoul fell in the American zone. Millions of Korean lives would be shaped by a line drawn by two men who knew nothing about Korea and cared less. In the north, the Soviets installed Kim Il-sung, a guerrilla fighter who had spent years in the Soviet Union and China fighting Japanese occupation. In the south, the Americans faced a problem. The most popular political movements in Korea were leftist or communist, shaped by years of resistance to Japanese fascism. The population wanted land reform and independence, as most of the land was owned by a small elite who had collaborated with the Japanese. So the United States made a choice that would foreshadow its Cold War strategy. It sided with the collaborators, the landlords, and the police who had served the Japanese occupation. It installed Syngman Rhee, a man who had lived in the United States for decades and who was reliably anti-communist, as the leader of South Korea. His government imprisoned tens of thousands of political opponents, crushed labor unions, massacred protesters, and ruled through the same police force that had served the Japanese. The United States backed him completely, providing military aid, economic support, and political cover. Democracy was acceptable only when it produced the right results. In South Korea, where democracy would have meant land reform and potentially communist influence, the United States chose dictatorship. By 1950, the division had calcified into two separate states. North Korea, backed by the Soviets and increasingly by Communist China, had implemented land reform and industrialization. South Korea, backed by the Americans, remained largely agricultural, dominated by landlords, and ruled by an authoritarian regime. Both governments claimed to be the legitimate government of all Korea because both wanted reunification, but on their own terms. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded the South. They captured Seoul within days, and within weeks they'd pushed South Korean and American forces into a tiny perimeter around the port city of Pusan. It looked like the North would reunify the country by force. The United States intervened massively. Truman committed American forces without asking Congress for a declaration of war. By early 1951, the war had settled into a brutal stalemate right back around the 38th parallel. Peace negotiations dragged on for 2 more years before ending in July 1953, with a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died on each side, including roughly 36,000 Americans. But it was even deadlier for civilians, somewhere between 2 and 3 million Koreans. The United States dropped 635,000 tons of bombs on Korea, more than in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. Napalm was used extensively. General Curtis LeMay later said, "We burned down just about every city in North Korea and South Korea both." He estimated American bombs wiped out 20% of North Korea's population. The war ended without a victor, but the consequences were permanent. The Korean peninsula remained divided, militarized, and hostile. In the north, Kim Il-sung consolidated power and built one of the most repressive regimes in modern history, justified in part by the existential threat posed by American military presence in the south. In the south, Syngman Rhee continued his dictatorship until 1960, when mass protests forced him to flee to Hawaii. He was replaced by a series of military dictatorships, backed by the United States, that ruled until the late 1980s. American troops remained in South Korea, and they are still there today, 7 decades later. Guatemala, the template for corporate coup. The United States had been intervening in Central America and the Caribbean for decades before World War III began, not to stop communism, which barely existed there, but to protect American corporate interests. Marine Corps Major General Smedley Butler, one of the most decorated soldiers in American history, described the system with brutal honesty in his 1935 book, War is a Racket.
I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China, in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way.
Butler was describing what would later be called banana republics, basically colonies where American corporations owned the land, controlled the infrastructure, ran the governments, and called in American military force whenever local people demanded better conditions. The biggest of these corporations was the United Fruit Company. At its height in the 1950s, United Fruit owned 42% of Guatemala's land, controlled its only major port, owned the railroad, and ran the telephone system. It paid almost nothing in taxes and basically ran Guatemala as its own private kingdom. United Fruit had been in Guatemala since the 1890s. Through deals with friendly dictators, the company acquired hundreds of thousands of acres of the best farmland. Much of it sat unused, held to keep competitors out, while Guatemalan peasants starved on tiny plots. Workers lived in company towns, got paid in scrip that could only be spent at company stores, and had no labor rights. If they tried to organize, they were fired or eliminated. The company controlled the only railroad, the main port, and the telegraph system. If you wanted to export anything from Guatemala, you had to go through United Fruit and pay whatever they demanded. They didn't just dominate the banana industry, they had a stranglehold on the entire economy. Politically, United Fruit made sure Guatemalan government served its interests. They bribed officials, funded friendly politicians, and worked with dictators who crushed any dissent. United Fruit liked dictatorships. They provided order, cheap labor, and no interference. In 1944, a popular uprising brought something like democracy to Guatemala for the first time. Then, in 1951, Jacobo Arbenz was elected president on a platform of land reform. He believed Guatemala's resources should benefit Guatemalans. That made him a target. Arbenz's land reform, Decree 900, was simple. If you owned land and weren't farming most of it, the government could buy the unused portions and give them to landless peasants. You'd be compensated based on the value you'd declared for taxes. And here's what enraged United Fruit. They'd been declaring their land was worth almost nothing to dodge taxes. Now they'd be paid based on those same low numbers. The company launched a massive propaganda campaign framing land reform as communist theft, and they had deep connections in Washington. Former CIA Director Walter Bedell Smith sat on United Fruit's board, while Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Alan Dulles had both worked for the law firm that represented the company. They convinced the Eisenhower administration that Arbenz was a communist threat. It was a lie. Arbenz was doing land reform similar to what America itself had pushed in Japan after World War II. He wasn't even a Communist Party member, but the Eisenhower administration, staffed with men who had ties to United Fruit, decided to overthrow him anyway. In 1953, the CIA started planning to remove the democratically elected president and replace him with a dictatorship. The CIA operation combined propaganda, economic pressure, and paramilitary action. They set up a radio station broadcasting lies about Arbenz, recruited Guatemalan exiles to train at bases in Honduras and Nicaragua, and picked a colonel named Carlos Castillo Armas to lead the coup. This is the same playbook that would later fail spectacularly at the Bay of Pigs. The U.S. also squeezed Guatemala economically, cutting off aid, pressuring other countries to stop trading with them, and working with United Fruit to create shortages. The goal was to make life hard enough that Guatemalans would blame Arbenz. In June 1954, Castillo Armas invaded from Honduras. The actual operation was tiny, a few hundred men and a handful of planes, but CIA propaganda made it look like a massive uprising. Radio broadcasts claimed huge armies were marching on the capital. Planes dropped leaflets demanding Arbenz resign. Agents spread rumors the government was collapsing. Arbenz asked the United States for help. He was a democratically elected leader facing a foreign-backed invasion. He thought he'd get international support. Instead, the U.S. refused and blocked UN intervention. His own military abandoned him, so he resigned. Castillo Armas took power and immediately gave the land back to United Fruit. Unions were outlawed. Peasants were forced off their land. Guatemala went back to dictatorship, this time openly backed by the CIA. What followed was one of the longest and bloodiest civil wars in Latin American history. After the coup, repression started immediately. Anyone connected to Arbenz was targeted. Thousands were arrested, thousands more eliminated. The CIA provided lists of people to eliminate, the same technique they'd used later in Indonesia and across Latin America. A series of U.S.-backed military governments ruled Guatemala, each one crushing any opposition. Elections were rigged. Opposition candidates were taken out. The military controlled everything. In the 1960s, a guerrilla insurgency emerged. The Guatemalan military, trained and armed by the United States, responded by targeting entire communities. The logic was simple. If guerrillas had support in Mayan villages, then the villages themselves were the enemy. Between 1960 and 1996, soldiers massacred hundreds of indigenous communities in deliberate campaigns of extermination. The violence peaked in the early 1980s under Efrain Rios Montt, an evangelical Christian who believed he was doing God's work. His forces destroyed over 600 villages and wiped out tens of thousands of indigenous people. The Reagan administration backed him. Reagan called Rios Montt a man of great personal integrity who was getting a bum rap from human rights organizations. American officials knew about the massacres, but they didn't care. Indigenous Mayan lives were expendable. The Truth Commission that investigated after the war concluded the military had committed genocide. 93% of human rights violations were committed by the state. Over 200,000 people were disappeared, and the United States had supported the whole thing. The coup had nothing to do with communism. It was about protecting United Fruit's profits. 200,000 Guatemalans died over 40 years so a fruit company could keep exploiting the country. United Fruit got exactly what it wanted. The company later became Chiquita Brands International. In the 2000s, Chiquita got caught paying millions to right-wing death squads in Colombia. They paid a fine. Nobody went to prison. This is how American foreign policy actually works in Latin America. Corporations figure out what they want. The government makes up a national security excuse. The CIA organizes a coup. A dictator gets installed. The corporations get their profits. The people die. And Americans get told it's all about freedom and democracy. Before there was an American war in Vietnam, there was a French war, and before that, there was French colonialism. Vietnam, along with Laos and Cambodia, became French Indochina, a colony exploited for rubber, rice, and coal. that enriched France while impoverishing the Vietnamese. By the 1940s, nationalist and communist movements had emerged to resist colonial rule, led by Ho Chi Minh. When World War II ended and Japan surrendered, Ho saw his chance. On September 2, 1945, he declared Vietnamese independence in Hanoi, reading from a declaration that borrowed directly from America's. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He'd studied in France, lived in the United States, and believed America might support Vietnamese independence. He couldn't have been more wrong. The United States chose France. American ships transported French troops back to Vietnam. American weapons armed them. American money funded their war. By 1954, the U.S. was paying 80% of the cost of France's attempt to reconquer its colony. The stated reason was containing communism. But internal documents reveal the real concerns. A 1950 National Security Council document said the U.S. needed to prevent communist control of Southeast Asia to maintain access to important sources of certain strategic materials. Eisenhower himself, explaining his domino theory, specified resources. The tin and tungsten that we so greatly value from that area would cease coming. If Vietnam went communist, American corporations would lose access to rubber, rice, tin, tungsten, and oil. Worse, the example might spread. The Vietnamese, despite being outgunned, fought with the conviction of people defending their homeland. In 1954, they won a stunning victory at Dien Bien Phu, forcing France out of the war. The Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel and called for nationwide elections in 1956 to reunify the country. The United States prevented those elections. Eisenhower later admitted why.
I have never talked or corresponded with a person knowledgeable in Indo-Chinese affairs who did not agree that had elections been held as of the time of the fighting, possibly 80% of the population would have voted for the communist Ho Chi Minh as their leader rather than chief of state Bao Dai.
So the elections never happened. The U.S. installed Ngo Dinh Diem as leader of South Vietnam, a country that hadn't existed before and only existed now because America said it did. The United States spent the next 2 decades claiming it was defending South Vietnam's sovereignty, when South Vietnam only existed because America had blocked the Vietnamese people from voting. Diem was a Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country who'd spent years living abroad. He had no popular support. He was chosen because he'd protect landlords and foreign investors and oppose land reform. His government was a disaster. He imprisoned opponents, tortured dissidents, rigged elections, and favored Catholics over Buddhists. His family was staggeringly corrupt. His brother ran a secret police that terrorized the population. His sister-in-law, Madame Nhu, called the self-immolation of Buddhist monks protesting persecution a barbecue. The problem was that many Vietnamese wanted what Ho Chi Minh had promised: land reform, independence, a government that served them. In the north, peasants now owned their land. In the south, Diem protected landlords and forced peasants off land they'd claimed during the war. By the late 1950s, South Vietnamese guerrillas, the Viet Cong, were organizing in the countryside. The insurgency emerged from conditions in the south, not from the north. The U.S. responded by sending more money, weapons, and advisors. By 1963, over 16,000 American military personnel were in South Vietnam, but Diem kept losing. So the CIA helped orchestrate his assassination. In 1964, the USS Maddox was allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. President Johnson used this to push through Congress the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving him authority to use military force without declaring war. Decades later, declassified documents revealed the truth. The first attack was real, but grossly misrepresented. The Maddox had been supporting raids on North Vietnam. The second attack never happened. Sailors had fired at radar shadows. The commander on scene sent messages saying he doubted there'd been any attack. The Johnson administration ignored this and told Congress it was unprovoked aggression. It was a deliberate lie to justify a war they'd already decided to fight. The bombing began in 1965. American ground troops arrived that March. By 1968, there were over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. More bombs were dropped on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia than in all of World War II. Napalm burned villages and people. Agent Orange poisoned millions of acres, causing birth defects that continue today. Free fire zones meant anything that moved could be shot. The strategy was attrition. Take out enough people and the Vietnamese would give up. But this ignored a fundamental reality. The Vietnamese were fighting for their home. Americans were fighting for reasons most couldn't articulate. January 30th, 1968, during the Vietnamese New Year, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. Saigon itself came under attack, including the American embassy. The city of Hue was captured and held for weeks. Militarily, Tet was pushed back. The Viet Cong suffered enormous casualties. But strategically, it was devastating. It proved the Viet Cong could organize a massive operation across the entire country, impossible without extensive local support. It showed that years of escalation had accomplished nothing, and it proved the South Vietnamese government had no popular support. Otherwise, someone would have warned about the buildup. Walter Cronkite, America's most trusted news anchor, went to Vietnam and concluded the war was unwinnable.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
Johnson reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Public opinion turned against the war, but it continued for 7 more years. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, revealed what officials knew. Successive administrations understood the war was likely unwinnable. They knew South Vietnam's government was corrupt and unpopular. They continued anyway. The war spread. The U.S. secretly bombed Laos from 1964 to 1973, making it the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. Unexploded bombs still hurt farmers today. Cambodia was carpet bombed starting in 1969. Over 500,000 tons dropped without telling Congress. The bombing destabilized Cambodia and helped bring the Khmer Rouge to power. They went on to take the lives of 2 million Cambodians. South Vietnam fell in 1975. Helicopters lifted Americans from embassy rooftops while desperate Vietnamese tried to climb aboard. Vietnam was reunified under communist leadership, exactly what would have happened peacefully in 1956 if the U.S. had allowed the elections. 20 years, millions dead, billions spent, countries destroyed, and the result was what would have happened anyway if America had simply let the Vietnamese choose. The war briefly made Americans skeptical of intervention, but the deeper lessons were never learned. The war got framed as a mistake, a strategic error, good intentions gone wrong. This let Americans avoid confronting reality. The U.S. deliberately prevented democracy because it would have produced the wrong result. It deliberately supported dictatorships. It deliberately escalated even when officials knew they couldn't win. Vietnam proved America would fight long, destructive wars to prevent countries from choosing economic independence. Vietnam was World War III at its most visible, fought in full view of global media, protested by millions. It showed the pattern clearly. American politicians learned a different lesson. Intervention wasn't wrong, it just needed better PR and local proxies instead of American troops. Visible wars created problems at home. Future wars would be more hidden. Indonesia should have been impossible to control. The archipelago stretched across 3,000 miles of ocean with over 17,000 islands, where hundreds of ethnic groups spoke hundreds of languages. By 1965, about 100 million people lived there, the 4th most populous country in the world. It sat on some of the world's richest deposits of oil, natural gas, tin, copper, gold, and nickel. And it controlled vital shipping lanes between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. In 1965, Indonesia had a popular president who wanted to use those resources for Indonesians rather than foreign corporations. Sukarno, the founding father of Indonesian independence, had been moving left, nationalizing Dutch and British oil companies, implementing land reform, and withdrawing from the UN and World Bank, which he called tools of Western imperialism. He'd brought the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI, into his government. The PKI was the third largest communist party in the world, with about 3 million members and millions more in affiliated unions and organizations. From America's perspective, Indonesia was slipping away. If it went fully communist, the United States would lose access to one of the most resource-rich regions in the world. The CIA had been trying to destabilize his government since the 1950s. In 1958, the agency backed a regional rebellion, even providing pilots who flew bombing missions. It failed, and when an American pilot was shot down and captured, CIA involvement was exposed. By the early 1960s, American policy shifted to cultivating the Indonesian military as a counterweight to Sukarno and the PKI. On the night of September 30th, 1965, junior military officers kidnapped and eliminated 6 senior generals. They claimed they were preventing a CIA-backed coup against Sukarno. General Suharto immediately declared this was a communist coup attempt, but this made no sense. Sukarno's government had already nationalized industries, implemented land reform, and brought communists into power. Why would communists stage a coup against their own government? Suharto crushed the movement within hours, then turned on the PKI. He blamed the entire party for the generals' deaths and claimed without evidence that communists had been planning to slaughter military families. The military-controlled media spread fabricated stories about communist atrocities, stories disproven by autopsies but effective at creating the emotional climate for genocide. Starting in October 1965, the military began arresting and eliminating PKI members, first party leaders and organizers, then anyone who'd attended a meeting or appeared on a membership list, then anyone accused by a neighbor. The military often didn't hurt them directly. They armed civilian militias, particularly from Muslim and nationalist groups, gave them lists of names, told them communists were planning to hurt Muslims, and set them loose. Neighbors attacked neighbors, settling old grudges under cover of anti-communist purges. In 5 months, between 500,000 and 1 million people were eliminated, and the United States helped. This is historical record now, confirmed by declassified documents. The CIA provided lists of thousands of names, from national leaders down to local organizers. Embassy officials met regularly with Indonesian military officers, getting updates on the situation and checking off names as people were confirmed dead. The U.S. provided weapons and communications equipment to coordinate massacres across the archipelago. Suharto formally took power in 1967 and ruled for 32 years. He called it the New Order. It meant dictatorship, corruption, and economic policies designed to benefit foreign corporations. He reversed everything Sukarno had done. Foreign oil companies came back with favorable contracts. Mining companies got access to Indonesia's minerals. The country rejoined the World Bank and IMF. Foreign investment poured in. For Indonesians, it meant poverty and repression. Hundreds of thousands who survived the massacre were imprisoned for decades without trial. The economic growth that followed benefited foreign investors and a small Indonesian elite. Profits from oil, minerals, and timber enriched foreign corporations, while most Indonesians stayed poor. This was the development model America promoted, a country open to investment, ruled by a dictator willing to use violence, where labor was cheap and regulations didn't exist. The Middle East has some of the world's largest oil reserves, and whoever controls that oil controls the global economy. The United States has been willing to overthrow democracies, install dictators, and support the most oppressive regimes on the planet to maintain that control. The pattern is the same as everywhere else. Popular governments that try to use their own resources for their own people get destroyed. Brutal dictatorships that give Western corporations access get supported. The justification changes, stopping communism, fighting terrorism, protecting human rights, but the policy stays the same. Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was everything America claimed to support, a democratically elected secular leader who believed in constitutional government. But he also believed Iran's resources should benefit Iranians. In 1951, he nationalized the country's oil. For decades, Iranian oil had been controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British corporation. The terms were outrageous. Britain took 85% of the profits, while Iran got 15%. Iranian workers lived in slums, while British executives lived in luxury compounds. When Iran asked for better terms, the company refused. So Mossadegh nationalized the oil. Britain organized a boycott and froze Iranian assets. When that failed, they asked the U.S. for help overthrowing him. Truman refused, but when Eisenhower took office, the CIA started planning a coup. The justification was that Mossadegh was moving toward communism. This was a lie. He'd actually suppressed Iran's Communist Party. His only crime was insisting on Iranian control of Iranian oil. In August 1953, the CIA orchestrated Operation Ajax, a plan to destabilize the government and install the Shah, who would be more friendly with Western corporations. The first attempt failed, and the Shah fled the country. The CIA tried again a few days later. This time it worked. Mossadegh was arrested, then the Shah returned and went on to rule for 26 years as a brutal dictator. He created SAVAK, a secret police force trained by the CIA that became one of the most feared in the world. SAVAK tortured thousands: activists, students, intellectuals, anyone who opposed the Shah. American officials knew because SAVAK was trained by the CIA, and the torture manuals came from the United States. The policy continued because the Shah kept oil flowing to the West, bought billions in American weapons, and opposed Soviet influence. The torture of thousands was considered an acceptable price. By the late 1970s, Iranian society was ready to explode. In 1979, a revolution overthrew the Shah. Ayatollah Khomeini emerged as the most powerful figure, and Iran became a theocratic state. The religious extremists consolidated power partly because they were the only opposition that hadn't been compromised by collaboration with the Shah's regime. SAVAK had infiltrated or destroyed secular Democrats and leftists over the decades. The religious conservatives operating out of mosques were harder to penetrate. This pattern would repeat across the developing world. Decades of American support for brutal dictators positioning extremists as the only legitimate opposition. Americans wonder why Iranians chanted "Death to America" after the revolution. The answer is simple. The United States overthrew their democracy, installed a dictator, and trained the secret police who tortured them for 26 years. Egypt and Nasser, punishing independence. Gamal Abdel Nasser came to power in Egypt in 1952 and became the face of Arab nationalism, a movement to end Western domination and use Arab resources for Arab development. Nasser's policies transformed Egypt. He implemented land reform, giving hundreds of thousands of peasants land they'd never imagined owning. He built schools and hospitals, expanded education, gave women the right to vote, and constructed the Aswan High Dam. He nationalized industries and directed development toward ordinary Egyptians. His foreign policy was non-alignment. Egypt wouldn't be a client of either superpower. This made him a threat. When Nasser asked for Western help building the Aswan Dam and was refused after he established relations with China, he turned to the Soviets. When Britain wouldn't sell him weapons, he bought them from the Soviet bloc. These moves were portrayed as proof he was communist, though he'd asked the West first and actually suppressed communists in Egypt. In 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain, France, and Israel invaded. The plan was to overthrow Nasser, but it failed. Surprisingly, Eisenhower opposed the invasion and threatened economic consequences. Nasser emerged as a hero who stood up to colonial powers, but the U.S. never stopped trying to undermine him. The CIA attempted assassination multiple times. American officials worked to weaken Egypt economically and support its rivals. The 1967 war, where Israel destroyed much of Egypt's military, broke Nasser. He died of a heart attack in 1970. After Nasser, Egypt was led by Anwar Sadat, who reversed everything, expelling Soviet advisors, opening Egypt to Western investment, and making peace with Israel. Egypt became the second largest recipient of American aid. Sadat was assassinated in 1981, replaced by Hosni Mubarak, who ruled as a dictator for 30 years with full American support. When Egyptians rose up in 2011 and forced Mubarak out, the U.S. eventually backed a military coup that overthrew Egypt's first democratically elected president. The general who led that coup, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, has ruled ever since with even more repression than Mubarak. Egypt today is poorer, more unequal, and more repressive than under Nasser. Millions of Egyptians look back at his era as a time when their government actually tried to serve them. The Petrodollar. If you want to understand American priorities in the Middle East, compare how the U.S. treats Iran versus Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy with no elections, no political parties, no free press. Women couldn't drive until 2018. Atheism and homosexuality are punishable by death. Public beheadings happen regularly. In 2018, Saudi agents eliminated journalist Jamal Khashoggi inside their consulate, taking apart his body with a bone saw. The CIA concluded the Crown Prince ordered it. The U.S. did essentially nothing. Saudi Arabia has been bombing Yemen since 2015, creating one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Hundreds of thousands have died. Schools and hospitals have been deliberately targeted. American weapons and intelligence support the campaign. 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers were Saudi, yet the U.S. invaded Afghanistan and Iraq while maintaining its alliance with Saudi Arabia. As you might have guessed, oil has played a major role in how these alliances developed, but with Saudi Arabia, the relationship goes even deeper. Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard to pay for Vietnam without raising taxes. This created a problem. If the dollar wasn't backed by gold, why should other countries hold it? Henry Kissinger found the solution. Between 1973 and 1974, he negotiated agreements with Saudi Arabia that restructured the global economy. Saudi Arabia would sell oil exclusively in dollars and use its OPEC influence to ensure other producers did the same. They'd invest oil revenues in U.S. Treasury bonds. In exchange, the U.S. would provide military protection. This created the petrodollar system. Oil could only be bought with dollars, so every country needed dollar reserves. This created permanent global demand for the dollar regardless of American economic fundamentals. The U.S. could print money knowing global demand would absorb it. Americans could buy cheap imports because the dollar was artificially strong. And the U.S. could borrow at lower rates than its economy justified. Most importantly, America gained the ability to effectively tax the entire world. Every country converting currency to dollars to buy oil was paying tribute. This is why the U.S.-Saudi relationship is unbreakable. If Saudi Arabia abandoned the petrodollar, started accepting yuan or euros, American economic dominance would collapse. Countries that threaten the petrodollar face consequences. Iraq started selling oil in euros in 2000. By 2003, the U.S. had invaded. Libya's Gaddafi was planning a gold-backed African currency. In 2011, NATO intervened, Gaddafi was taken out, and the plan died with him. The stated justifications were weapons of mass destruction and humanitarian concerns. The threat to dollar dominance was the real reason. Alexander Haig, Reagan's Secretary of State, called Israel the largest American aircraft carrier in the world that cannot be sunk, does not carry even one American soldier, and is located in a critical region for American national security. Joe Biden said in 1986, "Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interests in the region." Israel has a powerful military that enforces American interests, shares intelligence, and conducts operations the U.S. wants done, but prefers not to do directly. The U.S. provides about $3.8 billion in military aid annually, money that must be spent on American weapons, subsidizing defense contractors. Israel receives diplomatic protection at the UN, where the U.S. has vetoed dozens of resolutions criticizing Israeli actions. It's often said that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, but this is very misleading. Israel is a democracy for Jewish Israelis, not for Palestinians under occupation who can't vote in Israeli elections or control their own lives. Even Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem call it apartheid, and the U.S. has overthrown democracies and supported dictatorships throughout the region. Clearly, democracy isn't the actual criteria. For centuries, Palestine was home to Muslims, Christians, and Jews living in relative peace. The idea that Jews and Arabs were ancient enemies is a modern invention. The Zionist project to create a Jewish state was explicitly colonial. Early leaders described it that way, speaking of bringing European civilization to land while ignoring the 700,000 Palestinians already living there. The 1948 war, known to Palestinians as the Nakba or catastrophe, expelled roughly 750,000 Palestinians. Their villages were destroyed, their land taken. The 1947 partition gave more than half the land to the Jewish population, which owned about 6% of the land and comprised a third of the population. Since 1967, Israel has occupied the West Bank and Gaza. Millions of Palestinians live under military control without basic rights. Settlements, illegal under international law, keep expanding. Palestinians can't move freely, can't build without permits that are almost never granted, and face constant threat of arrest. Gaza has been under blockade since 2007. Israel controls what enters and leaves. Even caloric intake is restricted. It's been an open-air prison for decades. In October 2023, Hamas launched an attack and took hostages. Israel responded with a campaign that has wiped out hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, leveled entire neighborhoods, and struck hospitals, schools, and refugee camps. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Israeli leaders for war crimes, including using starvation as a weapon. The UN has charged Israel with genocide, but the United States continues providing weapons. South America, Operation Condor, and the Dictatorship Network. While Central America had experienced American intervention for decades, South America's experience intensified in the 1960s and peaked in the 1970s. What made South America unique was the coordination between dictatorships. Military regimes across the continent cooperated through a network called Operation Condor, hunting down and eliminating leftists across borders. This was transnational state terror coordinated by intelligence agencies, supported by the United States, and designed to eliminate leftist politics throughout an entire continent. Between the mid-1960s and mid-1980s, dictatorships in Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia imprisoned hundreds of thousands and eliminated tens of thousands more. The dictatorships used systematic torture, not to gather information, but to terrorize entire populations. People were kidnapped, taken to secret detention centers, tortured for weeks or months, and often eliminated. Bodies were dumped in rivers, buried in mass graves, or thrown from aircraft into the ocean. Thousands disappeared, and their families never learned what happened. The United States trained the torturers, provided intelligence about who to target, supported the coups, and gave diplomatic cover as these regimes wiped out their own populations. American officials knew exactly what was happening. It was reported by human rights organizations and acknowledged in classified cables. The policy continued because eliminating the Latin American left was considered worth the cost in human lives. Brazil, 1964, the first domino. Brazil is South America's largest country, with an abundance of natural resources, which is why the United States has done everything in its power to control the country's political system. João Goulart became president in 1961. He was a moderate leftist who advocated land reform, limits on foreign profits, higher wages, and stronger unions. He wasn't a communist, just a reformer who believed Brazil's growth should benefit ordinary Brazilians. This made him a target. The CIA worked with Brazilian military officers to plan a coup. The U.S. positioned a naval task force offshore for support. On March 31, 1964, the military moved. Goulart fled rather than start a civil war. The coup took less than 48 hours. The new government immediately reversed his reforms. Land reform was canceled, unions were repressed, and opposition politicians were arrested. Brazil became a dictatorship that would last 21 years. The United States celebrated. Lincoln Gordon, the U.S. ambassador, called it the single most decisive victory of freedom in the mid-20th century. President Johnson recognized the new government immediately, and American aid flowed to the regime. The message to other Latin American militaries was clear: overthrow reformist governments and the United States will support you. Brazil's dictatorship pioneered torture techniques that would be exported across the continent. Brazilian officers shared their methods with counterparts in Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina. The school of torture refined in Brazil would be applied throughout South America in the 1970s. Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile in 1970. He was a democratic socialist who promised to transform Chile through constitutional means, nationalizing American-owned copper mines, implementing land reform, raising wages, expanding healthcare. American copper companies had been exploiting Chile's mines for years, so the United States decided to prevent him from taking office. The CIA tried bribing Chilean Congress members to vote against him. When that failed, they supported a plot to kidnap the military chief who opposed coups. The kidnapping went wrong and his life was ended, but it still failed to prevent Allende's inauguration. For the next 3 years, the U.S. worked to destroy his government. Nixon ordered the CIA to make the economy scream. American aid was cut off, international lenders were pressured to stop investing, and copper companies ensured Chile couldn't sell on international markets. The CIA funded opposition media and bribed trucking companies to strike. The economic pressure worked. Shortages developed, inflation rose, and the middle class turned against Allende. But he kept implementing his program, nationalizing mines, redistributing land, raising wages. For poor and working class Chileans, conditions improved dramatically. On September 11, 1973, the military launched a coup. They bombed the presidential palace with Allende inside. He refused to surrender and died during the assault. What followed was one of Latin America's most brutal dictatorships. Thousands were rounded up. The National Stadium became a detention center filled with death and torture. Victor Jara, a beloved folk singer, was among those eliminated. Soldiers broke his hands and mocked him. "Play guitar now," before shooting him. The United States supported Pinochet completely. Kissinger met with him and praised his government. When human rights abuses emerged, American officials dismissed the reports. A group of Chilean economists trained at the University of Chicago, the Chicago Boys, were given control of economic policy. They implemented radical free market reforms, privatization, deregulation, slashed social spending, crushed unions. The wealthy did extremely well. For ordinary Chileans, it was catastrophic. Unemployment rose, wages fell, poverty increased. Chile became one of the most unequal countries in the world. Pinochet ruled until 1990. Over 3,000 were disappeared. Tens of thousands were tortured. Chile's current constitution was written under Pinochet and still reflects his economic model. The inequality remains extreme. When Chileans protest, they're met with repression tracing directly back to methods perfected under Pinochet. The United States has never apologized. Kissinger faced no consequences. Pinochet died in 2006, old and wealthy, never fully held accountable. Argentina, the disappeared. The Argentine dictatorship that began in March 1976 used disappearance as systematic state policy. Between 1976 and 1983, approximately 30,000 people disappeared. These weren't people that died in battles. They were taken from homes, streets, and workplaces and simply vanished. The disappeared included union organizers, students, teachers, journalists, priests, nuns, and many with no political connections at all. Sometimes people disappeared because they knew someone suspected. The terror was arbitrary. Victims were kidnapped by security forces, often in unmarked cars in daylight, and taken to secret detention centers. Argentina had hundreds of these. The most notorious was the Navy Mechanics School, where an estimated 5,000 people were held, tortured, and eliminated. Most victims ended up in mass graves or thrown from planes into the ocean. They were drugged, loaded onto military aircraft, and pushed out while still alive. The military called these death flights. This ensured bodies would never be found. The Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo formed one of history's most remarkable resistance movements. Women whose children had disappeared gathered every Thursday in front of the presidential palace, wearing white headscarves and carrying photographs. The military disappeared some of the mothers themselves, but the protests continued. Their courage eventually brought international attention. The United States knew everything. Embassy officials received reports. The Carter administration talked about human rights but continued military aid. Reagan was even more supportive. The dictatorship ended in 1983, partly because of its disastrous war with Britain over the Falklands. Argentina made more progress than most countries in holding perpetrators accountable. Hundreds of officers were prosecuted, mass graves were excavated, and stolen children were identified through DNA testing. But that progress is now being reversed. In 2023, Javier Milei was elected alongside Victoria Villarruel, who has spent her career defending convicted war criminals. The government has embraced the discredited two demons theory, the claim that the dictatorship was simply a war between two equally violent sides rather than state terrorism against civilians. On the 2024 anniversary of the coup, the government released a video disputing the 30,000 figure. By year's end, over 400 workers at memory sites had been fired. The genetic database for identifying stolen children has had its budget slashed. The unit searching for kidnapped babies has been shut down. Operation Condor, coordinated continental terror. Operation Condor, established in 1975, was a cooperation agreement between the dictatorships of Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil. They agreed to hunt political refugees across borders and share intelligence about leftists throughout the region. Being exiled no longer meant being safe. If you fled Chile for Argentina, Argentine intelligence could arrest you and send you back, or just take you out there. The CIA knew about Operation Condor and provided communications equipment and intelligence. Declassified documents show Kissinger explicitly approved and encouraged the cooperation. Targets were kidnapped in one country and taken to another for torture. The coordination revealed this wasn't separate national decisions but a continental project supported by the United States to eliminate the left throughout South America. The torture techniques and death squad methods weren't invented independently. They were taught at the U.S. Army's School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia, later renamed the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation in a rebranding effort. The school trained tens of thousands of Latin American officers. Many of the worst human rights abusers in Latin American history graduated from it. In the 1990s, declassified training manuals revealed explicit instruction in torture, assassination, blackmail, and targeting civilians. Graduates included Roberto D'Aubusson, founder of Salvadoran death squads, Manuel Noriega, Argentine dictator Leopoldo Galtieri, Bolivian dictator Hugo Banzer, and hundreds of officers involved in massacres across Latin America. The United States claims the school promoted professionalism and human rights. The documented record of its graduates says otherwise. It was a training ground for dictators and death squad leaders. Central America. In the 1980s, Central America became a laboratory for death squads that wiped out over 300,000 people in just one decade. Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala became fields of death. Honduras became a staging ground for American operations. Panama was invaded when its dictator stopped following orders. The decade left Central America devastated, hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced, economies destroyed, societies traumatized in ways that continue today. When Central Americans flee the violence and poverty these policies created, when they walk thousands of miles to reach the U.S. border, they're called invaders and criminals. The connection between what the United States did to Central America and why Central Americans are fleeing is rarely acknowledged. The people arriving at the border are the consequences of American foreign policy coming home. The United States had controlled Cuba since winning it from Spain in 1898, and even after Cubans won independence in 1902, the Platt Amendment gave Washington military control over the region. By the 1950s, the ruling dictator Fulgencio Batista had turned Havana into a haven for the mafia and American business interests. American companies owned 90% of Cuban mines, 80% of its public utilities, 50% of its railways, and 40% of its sugar production. The mob boss Meyer Lansky operated openly with Batista's blessing, building casinos while funneling millions into the dictator's Swiss bank accounts. For ordinary Cubans, this meant poverty and repression. The average family earned about $6 a week. Between 15 and 20% of the workforce was chronically unemployed. Batista's secret police tortured and murdered anyone who challenged the system, while American officials looked the other way because the dictator kept Cuba open for business. In 1953, a young Cuban lawyer named Fidel Castro attempted to kick off a revolution by attacking an army barracks and ended up in prison. When he returned from exile in Mexico in 1956 with 80 guerrillas, Batista's forces killed most of them within days. Only about 20 survivors made it into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, including an Argentine doctor named Che Guevara, who had witnessed the CIA's destruction of Guatemala's democracy 2 years earlier. From the mountains, Castro's small band grew into a genuine revolutionary army because Batista's corruption had alienated nearly everyone. On New Year's Eve 1958, with rebel forces closing in, Batista packed 3 planes with as much wealth as he could carry and fled. Cubans poured into the streets, ransacked the casinos, and threw slot machines into the street because these symbols of American exploitation had bled the country for decades. The standard American story is that Washington opposed Castro because he was a communist who aligned with the Soviet Union. The actual sequence tells a different story. Castro did not declare himself a Marxist-Leninist until December 1961, nearly 3 years after taking power, and his alignment with Moscow came after American hostility made any other option impossible. What actually happened was that Castro nationalized American corporations, threatening approximately $1 billion in investments and demonstrating to every other Latin American country that an alternative to colonization was possible. By March 1960, President Eisenhower had authorized the CIA to plan an invasion. The CIA's plan was essentially a repeat of Guatemala in 1954. Train exiles, provide air support, create the impression of a massive uprising, and watch the government collapse. The problem was that Castro had studied Guatemala and prepared for exactly this kind of attack. Cuban intelligence knew about the training camps in Guatemala months in advance. On April 17, 1961, about 1,400 exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs and immediately came under heavy fire. Castro ordered 20,000 troops to the beach. Within 3 days, the invasion was crushed with about 100 dead and over 1,100 captured. The failed invasion accelerated Cuba's turn toward Moscow because Castro now had proof that he needed a powerful ally to survive. After the Bay of Pigs, the Kennedy administration launched Operation Mongoose, a campaign of sabotage and assassination. Declassified documents show the CIA planned to attack power plants, oil refineries, and sugar mills, with the goal of bringing hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government. The CIA explored at least 8 assassination plots against Castro, including working with the American mafia, poisoning his cigars, and rigging an exploding seashell to kill him while diving. Operation Northwoods, proposed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, called for staging fake terrorist attacks on American soil and blaming them on Cuba to justify invasion. The proposals included bombing American ships and shooting down an American civilian aircraft. In summer 1962, Khrushchev proposed placing nuclear missiles in Cuba. Castro agreed because he saw no other way to guarantee survival. When American spy planes discovered the missile sites in October, Kennedy chose a naval blockade over the military strikes his Joint Chiefs wanted. What American planners did not know was that Soviet forces in Cuba already possessed tactical nuclear weapons, with authority to use them if invaded. The crisis ended when Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for Kennedy's promise not to invade Cuba. Kennedy also secretly agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey, a quid pro quo hidden from the public for years because it would have made the resolution look like less of a win for the Americans. The economic embargo Kennedy imposed in February 1962 would become the longest-lasting sanctions regime in American history. The original purpose, according to declassified documents, was to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government. This has been the theory behind American sanctions ever since, and it has been proven wrong for over 60 years. The embargo bans nearly all trade between the United States and Cuba and restricts foreign companies that deal with Cuba from accessing American markets. In 1997, the American Association for World Health found that the embargo contributed to malnutrition, poor water access, and lack of medicine. Every year since 1992, the United Nations General Assembly has voted to condemn the embargo, typically with only the United States and Israel in favor of maintaining it. The embargo has achieved none of its stated goals. The Castro government was not overthrown. Fidel ruled until 2008, then handed power to his brother Raul, and the Communist Party remains in power today. Nicaragua had basically been a U.S. colony since the early 1900s. Marines had occupied the country multiple times. American corporations controlled the economy, and from 1937 to 1979, the Somoza family ruled as a personal dictatorship with full American support. They ran Nicaragua as a family business, stealing from the treasury, owning vast estates, taking out anyone who opposed them. Franklin Roosevelt reportedly said of the first Somoza, "He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." That summarized American policy perfectly. The Somozas were brutal, but they served American interests. In exchange, the U.S. provided military aid and trained the National Guard, which functioned as the family's private army. By the 1970s, the dictatorship had become so corrupt it provoked widespread opposition. The Sandinistas had been fighting a guerrilla war since the 1960s. After the 1972 earthquake destroyed much of Managua, Somoza stole international aid money meant for reconstruction. Even business elites turned against him. In 1979, the Sandinistas overthrew Somoza in a revolution that wiped out about 50,000 people. They took power and began reforms, a massive literacy campaign, land reform, expanded healthcare, and nationalization of properties the Somozas had stolen. When Reagan took office in 1981, U.S. policy shifted to overthrowing them. Reagan claimed Nicaragua was becoming a Soviet satellite. The actual concern was that a successful leftist government would inspire similar movements elsewhere. The CIA organized the Contras, made up largely of former Somoza National Guard members. Based in Honduras, they launched raids into Nicaragua, attacking farms, health clinics, and schools. Their tactics were explicitly terrorist. They targeted teachers and healthcare workers. They tortured civilians and burned crops. Reagan called them freedom fighters and compared them to the American founding fathers. In reality, they were a terrorist organization committing atrocities against civilians. El Salvador was the smallest country in Central America, but one of the most unequal. 14 families controlled most of the land and wealth, while the majority lived in poverty as landless peasants. This extreme inequality created conditions for revolution. By the late 1970s, guerrilla groups were demanding land reform. The military government responded with massive repression. In 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero was assassinated after speaking out against the violence. His sermons criticized the military, and he called on soldiers to disobey orders to eliminate civilians. A week after pleading for the violence to stop, a death squad assassin shot him at the altar. Later that year, 4 American churchwomen, 2 nuns and 2 lay missionaries, were assaulted and eliminated by Salvadoran soldiers. Reagan administration officials suggested they'd brought it on themselves. UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick said they were not just nuns, but political activists, as if that justified the violence. The main death squad leader was Roberto d'Aubusson, a School of the Americas graduate who ordered Archbishop Romero's assassination. The Reagan administration supported him anyway, providing weapons and money to the military that worked with his death squads. The guerrillas unified into the FMLN and launched a full-scale insurgency. The Civil War wiped out approximately 75,000 over 12 years. The vast majority were civilians that were taken out by government forces. The military used scorched earth tactics. They'd surround villages, eliminate everyone, burn the houses, destroy the crops. The El Mozote massacre in December 1981 was one of the worst. The U.S.-trained Atla-Cattle Battalion surrounded the village and systematically executed everyone, approximately 1,000 people, including hundreds of children. The Reagan administration denied it happened. When journalists reported it, officials called them liars. Years later, forensic excavations confirmed everything survivors had described. The United States provided over $6 billion in aid to El Salvador during the 1980s, most of it military. American advisors coordinated operations. American intelligence identified targets. American weapons took the lives of Salvadoran civilians. The war ended in 1992. The peace accords didn't address the inequality that caused the war. The oligarchy kept its wealth. The violence continued in different form. Former soldiers and guerrillas, trained in violence with no opportunities, formed criminal gangs. MS-13 and Barrio 18 trace their origins partly to the Civil War. When Salvadorans flee gang violence today, they're fleeing conditions created by the war the United States funded. The gangs are a direct consequence. The poverty is a consequence of the economic system the war preserved. This connection is never made in American discourse. Immigrants are framed as a problem, not as consequences of American policy. Honduras avoided civil war but became the staging ground for American operations throughout Central America. The U.S. built massive military bases there. Honduras had its own death squad, Battalion 316, trained by the CIA and Argentine advisors. They kidnapped, tortured, and disappeared activists. The numbers were smaller than El Salvador, but the methods were the same. Ambassador John Negroponte oversaw this from 1981 to 1985. He later denied knowledge of abuses. despite extensive documentation that he knew exactly what was happening. Honduras today remains one of Central America's poorest and most violent countries. When Hondurans flee, their fleeing conditions created partly by Honduras's role as an American military base. Panama, when the dictator stops following orders. Panama was different because of the canal. The U.S. had effectively created Panama in 1903 by supporting a rebellion against Colombia. In exchange, the new government gave America control over the canal zone. Manuel Noriega rose through military and intelligence services while working as a CIA asset. He provided intelligence and helped with U.S. operations. America paid and protected him even as evidence mounted he was trafficking drugs. In the late 1980s, Noriega stopped being useful, becoming too independent, demanding more money. He was indicted on drug trafficking charges for crimes he'd committed while on the CIA payroll. When he refused to step down, the United States invaded. Operation Just Cause in December 1989 was the largest U.S. military operation since Vietnam, 27,000 troops. The stated goal was capturing Noriega. The actual goal was demonstrating American power and removing a leader who'd stopped following orders. The invasion wiped out hundreds to thousands of civilians. The El Carrillo neighborhood was devastated, bombed and shelled, thousands of homes destroyed. Bodies were reportedly buried in mass graves to hide the death toll. Noriega was convicted of crimes he'd committed while working for the CIA. The invasion demonstrated what happened to Latin American leaders who stopped serving U.S. interests. Africa. Africa was where the violence of World War III could be most easily ignored. The continent was distant, its conflicts were portrayed as tribal rather than political, and the racism that permeated Western media ensured African deaths were treated as less significant than deaths elsewhere. Congo should have been one of Africa's richest countries. It contains vast deposits of copper, cobalt, diamonds, gold, and uranium. At independence in 1960, it had the resources to become a prosperous model for post-colonial Africa. Instead, Congo became one of history's greatest tragedies, a country deliberately impoverished to benefit foreign powers and corporations. The architect was the United States. Belgium had ruled Congo with extraordinary brutality. King Leopold's regime in the late 1800s took the lives of an estimated 10 million Congolese through forced labor, violence, and starvation. When independence movements swept Africa in the late 1950s, Belgium was forced to grant independence. Patrice Lumumba emerged as the leader. At the independence ceremony, while the Belgian king praised Belgium's colonial legacy, Lumumba gave an unscheduled response naming the reality of colonial rule, the forced labor, the violence, the exploitation. He said Congo would now control its own resources. It was a moment of incredible courage, speaking truths colonizers preferred to deny. Belgium, the United States, and the mining companies immediately recognized Lumumba as a threat. He talked about nationalizing mines. He was willing to accept aid from any country, including the Soviet Union. When Western powers blocked UN assistance, Lumumba turned to the Soviets. This was all the excuse the CIA needed. President Eisenhower authorized Lumumba's elimination. CIA Chief Alan Dulles cabled the Congo station chief. In high quarters here, it is the clear-cut conclusion that if Lumumba continues to hold high office, the inevitable result will have disastrous consequences. His removal must be an urgent and prime objective. The CIA sent poison to be used in his food or toothpaste. When that proved difficult, they shifted to supporting his Congolese enemies. In September 1960, Colonel Mobutu, who'd been receiving CIA payments, launched a coup. Lumumba was placed under house arrest, escaped, was captured, and in January 1961 was beaten, tortured, and his life was ended. Belgian officers supervised his execution. His body was dissolved in acid. The CIA didn't pull the trigger, but American officials orchestrated his death. Lumumba was taken out because he insisted Congo's resources should benefit Congolese people. Mobutu took full power in 1965 and ruled until 1997. His regime was one of the most corrupt in modern history. He stole an estimated $5 billion, equivalent to Congo's entire external debt. He built palaces while his people starved. He ruled through violence, torturing and taking out opponents. The United States supported him throughout. He was seen as a reliable anti-communist ally. American aid flowed for 3 decades. When his corruption became too blatant, officials would express concern, Mobutu would make token gestures, and the aid would continue. American presidents received him at the White House. His policies destroyed Congo. He nationalized businesses and gave them to cronies who ran them into the ground. He printed money, causing hyperinflation. He neglected infrastructure until roads, hospitals, and schools collapsed. By the time he was forced from power, Congo was poorer than it had been at independence. The mining sector remained under foreign control. Copper, diamonds, and cobalt were extracted by foreign companies paying minimal taxes. The wealth flowed out while Congolese remained among the poorest on earth. This was exactly the arrangement Lumumba had wanted to change, exactly why he was taken out. Angola gained independence from Portugal in 1975 after a long liberation war. Three movements had fought colonial rule. When Portugal withdrew, they turned on each other. The MPLA, which had Soviet and Cuban support, formed the government. UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi, launched an insurgency backed by the United States and apartheid South Africa. The war lasted from 1975 to 2002, taking the lives over 500,000 people. The U.S. supported UNITA because the MPLA was socialist. It didn't matter that the MPLA was trying to build schools and hospitals. What mattered was they were aligned with the Soviet bloc. Reagan invited Savimbi to the White House. Conservative politicians praised him as a freedom fighter. The reality was different. Savimbi was a brutal warlord who controlled territory through terror. UNITA deliberately targeted civilians, destroyed infrastructure, laid mines that caused thousands of casualties, and kidnapped children as soldiers. They controlled diamond mines and became essentially a diamond trafficking operation, disguised as a liberation movement. UNITA's tactics were designed to make the country ungovernable. They bombed power stations and water facilities, attacked buses carrying civilians, destroyed schools and clinics. The goal wasn't winning support, but creating chaos. The CIA ran the operation out of Mobutu's Congo. American Stinger missiles shot down civilian planes. South African forces invaded repeatedly, fighting alongside UNITA. By 2002, over 500,000 were dead. Millions were displaced. The country was littered with landmines. Infrastructure was destroyed. Angola had the resources to prosper. Significant oil, diamonds, fertile land. But decades of war destroyed it all. The oil wealth enriched a small elite while most Angolans remained poor. The justification was fighting communism. The reality was preventing Angola from using its resources for development. The result was 500,000 dead and a country in ruins. Mozambique gained independence in 1975 under Frelimo, which established a socialist government and began improving literacy and healthcare. This threatened white minority rule in neighboring Rhodesia and South Africa. In retaliation, their intelligence services created Renamo, a rebel movement whose sole purpose was destabilization. Renamo wasn't an organic resistance. It was created, funded, and directed by apartheid intelligence services. Its strategy was pure terrorism. Renamo destroyed over 1,800 schools and 700 health clinics. They attacked transportation networks and mined roads. The result was famine. Over 1 million people died, many from starvation caused by Renamo's deliberate destruction. The United States supported Renamo indirectly through support for South Africa. When that became too obvious, conservative American organizations stepped in. The Heritage Foundation promoted Renamo. Conservative congressmen praised them as freedom fighters, despite overwhelming evidence of terrorism against civilians. The war ended in 1992 after apartheid South Africa collapsed. Mozambique was devastated. Over 1 million dead, 5 million displaced, the country littered with landmines. It remains one of the world's poorest countries, still recovering from a war designed to prevent its development. American support for UNITA and Renamo was part of a broader alliance with apartheid South Africa. The relationship reveals American priorities clearly. South Africa was a white supremacist state that denied basic rights to the black majority, enforced segregation through law, and maintained rule through systematic violence. But it was also anti-communist and gave Western corporations access to mineral wealth. For America, these factors outweighed everything else. Reagan called his policy constructive engagement, maintaining friendly relations while gently encouraging reform. In practice, it meant treating the apartheid regime as legitimate while viewing liberation movements with suspicion. This is why civil rights leader Nelson Mandela was labeled as a terrorist by Western countries. The U.S. vetoed UN sanctions. American corporations continued business there. The CIA shared intelligence with South African security services. The result was that South Africa felt confident conducting regional destabilization. The anti-apartheid movement eventually forced some change. Sanctions were imposed over Reagan's veto in 1986. Apartheid ended in 1994 with Mandela's election, but by then the damage was done. Decades of American support had enabled South Africa to maintain apartheid longer and conduct its regional destruction. Ethiopia under Emperor Haile Selassie was a longtime American ally. When a socialist military government overthrew him in 1974, American support shifted to Somalia. The superpowers essentially switched sides. The Ethiopia-Somalia War of 1977 to 78 was a straightforward proxy conflict. Somalia, armed by America, invaded Ethiopia. Ethiopia, backed by Soviet weapons and Cuban troops, repelled them. Tens of thousands died. It was fought because the superpowers picked sides, not because of any inherent conflict that couldn't have been negotiated. Ethiopia descended into civil war and famine. The 1983 to 85 famine wiped out hundreds of thousands. Somalia collapsed completely after the war ended. The government fell in 1991 and the country remains fragmented today. The collapse stemmed partly from decades of dictatorship under Siad Barre, propped up by American support. The superpowers treated the Horn as a chessboard, switching sides to deny each other influence. The result was decades of war, famine, and instability. West Africa saw numerous CIA-backed coups. Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, one of Africa's most prominent independence leaders, was overthrown in 1966 while traveling to China. The CIA helped destabilize his government. He'd promoted African unity and economic independence. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso was assassinated in 1987 after 4 years of ambitious reforms. He was taken out in a coup led by his colleague Blaise Compaoré, who then ruled as a Western-backed dictator for 27 years. The pattern was consistent. Leaders who promoted African independence were removed. Those who cooperated with Western extraction received support regardless of how they ruled. As you can see, the time that history books call the Cold War was just as brutal and destructive as both world wars, and it touched nearly every corner of the planet. Not recognizing this time as the Third World War makes it harder to understand how all of these conflicts were connected and who the real villains were. It also makes it more difficult to understand how geopolitics works today. The details covered here are just scratching the surface, but hopefully they illustrate how U.S. foreign policy has always been about resource extraction for the corporate elite. The millions dead from World War III deserve to be remembered, alongside victims of the world wars that earned the name. Their deaths should be understood not as unfortunate byproducts of noble efforts, but as direct results of policies designed to maintain empire at any cost. The refugees arriving at American borders deserve to be understood as consequences of American intervention. They're fleeing violence, poverty, and instability that American policy created, and they have every right to seek safety in the country whose government destroyed theirs.